They said she screamed for 7 hours without stopping, but not because of pain, because she remembered. You weren't supposed to hear that. You weren't supposed to know what happened in Georgia, 1841, behind the locked doors of Cypress Grove Plantation, where Southern gentility hid a horror so profound even the cruelest slave masters whispered about it only in dreams. But it's time you knew. This isn't just a story, it's a key, one you either use or bury forever. The official records say Catherine Rutled was the obese, unstable daughter of a mid-tier plantation owner. Sickly, erratic, a woman best kept indoors, a tragic case of feminine hysteria. But that's a lie, one of many. Because what really happened, what her father did, was not medicine. It was not treatment. It was not love. It was a transaction. On April the 12th, 1841, Silas Rutled, a man desperate for status among the region's secret elite, gave his only daughter to a man he considered less than property, not to punish her, not to help her, but to buy his way into power. He gave her, body, mind, and soul, to a man named Ezekiel Cross, an enslaved man, quiet, obedient, chosen carefully by forces older than the Confederacy, chosen not for his silence, but for what he had lost. What happened next destroyed 13 men. It leveled a plantation. It left every surviving witness incapable of speech for weeks. And it was covered up, not with silence, but with noise, misdirection, madness, tragedy, unexplained fire. But the truth still lives. Just beneath the floorboards, buried in scorched diaries and outlawed letters. You're not here by accident. You're here because you're ready to hear it, ready to become someone who sees past the veil. You were trained to reject this kind of truth, taught that what doesn't make sense should be dismissed, but understand this: the systems that shaped your life, schools, churches, governments, were built by men like Silas Rutled, men who'd sell their daughters to demons if it bought them another seat at the table, and that table still exists. Catherine Rutled wasn't born broken, she was made that way. From the moment she emerged screaming into a world owned by cotton and blood, her fate was already inked in ledgers, not love. Her mother bled out on the birthing table, and her father, Silas, didn't weep. He wrote it off as a loss, like a mule collapsing in the fields, just a cost of doing business. But Catherine remembered things she wasn't supposed to, and by 12, she'd seen more than any child should. That was the year she wandered into the wrong hallway, heard the wrong chant, looked down into the stone cellar, and saw 13 men in red-stained aprons standing in a circle, not around a table, but around a child, her age. What they did cannot be described without staining your soul. What matters is that Catherine never forgot. But Silas made sure no one would believe her. He fed her mercury-laced tonics under the lie of calming medicine, laudanum in her tea, isolation instead of education, every outburst punished with more poison, every scream dismissed as lunacy, every plea turned into more evidence of female hysteria, and society obeyed. The church women whispered prayers but stepped aside, the doctors nodded solemnly and scribbled nonsense, because no one dared question a man who wore fine coats and signed checks with the Brethren's seal. You think madness is born? Madness is engineered, and Catherine was the blueprint. By 28, she was swollen, trembling, violent when lucid, but not insane, never that, just trapped, behind chemical walls built by a father who feared what she knew. And then came the letter. A summons from the Brethren of the Harvest, a cabal older than most southern counties, born from a mix of old-world rituals and new-world bloodlust. Men who believed the land must be fed, with sacrifice, with secrecy, with submission. Silas owed them $12,000, and they offered forgiveness. Not with gold, but with a test. Give us your daughter, not to us directly, no. Give her to one of them, a slave. Let her fall completely into his hands. Tell the county it's medicine. Tell the church it's desperation. But we'll know what it really is: loyalty, submission, a father feeding the weak to the strong. And Silas, a man raised to believe power is worth any price, wrote back one word before sunrise. His name was Ezekiel Cross. To the county, he was just another knocking, tall, silent, obedient. A recent purchase from a Virginia estate, known for carpentry and herbal remedies. No whip scars, no complaints, no history worth noting. But that was a lie, a careful one, and Silas Rutled, like every man addicted to power, believed what he was told, because it was easy. Ezekiel wasn't random, he was chosen. You see, some men survive slavery, others endure it, but a rare few weaponize it. Ezekiel had spent the last 3 years being sold down the line, deliberately, from one plantation to the next, from Carolina to Alabama, always looking, listening, gathering names, watching rituals whispered in broken dialects and backwoods Latin. He wasn't just surviving, he was studying his enemy. Because Ezekiel had lost everything, not to war, not to disease, but to Silas Rutled. 3 years earlier, Silas purchased his wife and children, Sarah, Benjamin, and Ruth, not for work, but to prove a point. He'd been told by the brethren that sentimentality was weakness, that the powerful do what the weak won't, so he split a family to show he could. Sarah died of fever, Benjamin from untreated injury, Ruth, 6 years old, simply stopped eating. She didn't understand why her father never came, and now Silas had invited that man into his home. Ezekiel stepped off the wagon on April the 13th. The trader barely looked at him. Silas handed over papers, barely reading them. And when he looked into Ezekiel's eyes, calm, unbroken, knowing, he flinched. It was the first crack. Silas didn't recognize him. Why would he? To men like Silas, black faces blur, pain is anonymous, but Ezekiel recognized him, the way a knife recognizes its target. He was given a cabin separate from the other slaves, told his only job was Catherine, no fields, no labor, just care. But no one asked what Ezekiel wanted. He entered the room that night and pulled from his shirt a cloth bundle. 3 names, written by a child's hand: Sarah, Benjamin, Ruth. Then he whispered a sentence only the dead could hear. "We begin tomorrow." And the fire had already started. April 14th, 1841. The first time Ezekiel Cross stood in front of Catherine Rutled's door, he felt it, the rot behind the wood, not just illness, not just sorrow, but something spiritual, like the room was a cage for something that had seen too much and hadn't been allowed to scream. Judith, the housemaid, wouldn't go in. She knocked, announced Ezekiel softly, then backed away like a soldier retreating from the mouth of a cannon. There was silence. Then, a crash. Glass, maybe, or porcelain, followed by Catherine's voice, warped and venomous. "I said no more treatments." Judith flinched. "It's a bad day," she whispered, eyes wide with sympathy and fear. But Ezekiel didn't wait. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Darkness. Curtains drawn tight as a noose. The air smelled of sweat, mildew, and the metallic sweetness of mercury. Books and broken furniture littered the floor like a battlefield. In the corner, slouched in a wooden chair, was Catherine, her gown stained, her hair tangled, her eyes unfocused. This was the woman Silas had labeled a hysteric, a mad daughter, a burden. But Ezekiel didn't see madness. He saw poisoning. She stared at him, confused at first, then furious. "You're another doctor, aren't you? Another butcher with new medicine." He didn't move. "I'm not a doctor, miss. I'm here to help." She laughed, sharp and broken. "They all say that. And then they put things in my mouth, in my veins, in my head. Help means chains." Then she stood, unsteady, pale, but in her eyes, for a moment, was fire. "You think I don't know what this is," she spat. "It's punishment, because I remembered, because I spoke." Ezekiel's voice stayed calm. "What are you supposed to forget?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Catherine froze. Her face twisted, not in anger, but recognition. A flicker of clarity. "You don't know." "No, miss." "You've been brought here," she whispered, "and you don't know what happens in the cellar, what they do beneath this house." Ezekiel's heart pounded, but his face remained still. "I do not know, miss." She gave a bitter smile. "Then you're a liar, or a fool, but if you stay long enough you'll learn. Everyone learns." She slumped back into the chair, exhausted by the memory of something too large for words, and for the first time since stepping into that cursed room, Ezekiel pitied her. Ezekiel didn't answer her right away. He moved instead, slowly, deliberately, over to the curtains and pulled them open. Sunlight pierced the gloom like a blade, slashing through the room, illuminating years of dust and despair. Catherine cried out, shielding her eyes with trembling hands, but she didn't scream. She just sat there, stunned. And beneath her confusion, Ezekiel saw it again. The thing buried under layers of sedation and trauma. Will. "When did you last see the sun, miss?" he asked quietly. "I don't remember," she muttered. "I cannot walk that far. I'm too heavy, too weak." He turned to face her fully. "When did you last eat without laudanum in it?" Her hands lowered slowly from her face. Her eyes locked onto his, and something shifted. Something vital. "The medicine is necessary," she said, but there was no certainty in it. "The doctors said so. They always said so." Ezekiel stepped closer, but not threateningly. His voice dropped, deeper, firmer. "What if the doctors are wrong?" Her face twitched. "What if the medicine isn't helping, but keeping you quiet? What if your father doesn't want you well, Catherine?" That was the first time he used her name, and it hit like thunder. She sat bolt upright, breathing faster, hands clutching the arms of the chair so hard her knuckles turned white. He continued. "What if he's been poisoning you? Not to cure you, but to erase you, to make you forget what you saw, to make sure you never speak about it again." The silence after that question was volcanic. Catherine didn't blink. Her trembling stopped. Her eyes focused for the first time in years. She stared at him like a woman waking from a nightmare and realizing it wasn't a dream at all. It was a memory. Then, in a voice that was suddenly clear, "He told you." "No, miss," Ezekiel said. "Your father told me nothing. But I have eyes. I know what mercury poisoning looks like. I know what long-term laudanum use does to a body." Her eyes began to water, not from sadness, from fury. "Why are you saying this? Why would you help me?" Ezekiel met her gaze, steady, unwavering. "Because your father sold my wife and 2 children to their deaths, for nothing but approval, and I want him to suffer." Catherine leaned forward, the fire in her eyes blazing now. "Then we have something in common." This was no longer a treatment. It was an alliance. For the first time in years, Catherine felt something burn through the fog that had held her hostage. Not rage, not sorrow, clarity. The room seemed smaller now, sharper, as if Ezekiel's words had cut through some invisible veil, exposing details she hadn't noticed in years, the peeling edges of wallpaper, the mold along the window seam, the faint bloodstain on the wood near her bed. She remembered how it got there. A scream, a broken glass, her own wrist, slashed shallow, just to feel something real through the layers of numbing medicine. She had been trying to speak for years, with wounds, with silence, with madness. No one listened. But now, someone had. She studied Ezekiel, not with suspicion, but calculation. "You want revenge on my father. What did he do?" His answer came low, without hesitation. "He sold my wife and children to die, not for profit, not out of need, but to prove to his friends he was strong enough to do it, to earn their respect." Catherine closed her eyes. "The brethren," she whispered. Ezekiel nodded once, slowly. "You know them." She laughed, a sound not of amusement, but bitterness so dense it could have collapsed the walls. "Every child in this house learns their names in whispers. Judge Pelham, Reverend Crenshaw, Marcus Fanning. Their names open doors in public and slaughter innocents in secret." She stood, unsteady, but under her own strength. "If I agree," she said, "if I let you help me, what happens next?" Ezekiel didn't flinch. "You get clean, clear, strong enough to remember, strong enough to speak. And then, we decide what to do, together." Catherine's eyes narrowed. "And if I say I want them dead?" "Then we plan for that." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was sacred, like something ancient had just awoken between them, not love, not alliance, but shared hatred. And Catherine, this woman everyone had written off as broken, said something Ezekiel never expected. "I've already killed 3 of them, house slaves who tried to report my lucid days. I don't remember how, the laudanum clouds it, but they're gone. And I made them disappear." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. She smiled, a terrible smile. "So if you plan to betray me, if this is all another trick, understand something. I am not a victim. I am something worse." And in that moment, he believed her. For the next 48 hours, the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Judith, the housemaid, noticed the change but said nothing. Catherine no longer screamed through the walls. She no longer shattered glass or clawed at her sheets. There was no sobbing, no fits, no wild laughter echoing through the halls. Just silence, focused, dangerous. And it terrified Judith more than all the years of madness combined. Catherine had made a decision, and when a woman who has been brutalized into obedience chooses, it is no small thing. Ezekiel prepared for the detox like a soldier laying out weapons. He used what the forest behind the plantation could provide: valerian root for sleep, milk thistle to purge the poison, chamomile for the waves of nausea that would come like tides of fire. He brewed the tinctures himself, measured each drop. On the 3rd morning, he stepped into her room holding a cup of liquid the color of storm water. Catherine was sitting upright, her gown clean, her hair brushed. Her hands still trembled, but her eyes, they burned. She took the cup without question, drank every drop, then looked him in the eye. "Don't leave," she said. He didn't. What followed was not healing, it was war. The first wave hit that night. Tremors, vomiting, sweats. She writhed in her bed as the opiates began their exit, howling through every nerve in her body. Ezekiel sat by her side, holding the basin when she retched, pressing cool cloths to her forehead. He whispered stories, of Sarah, of Benjamin, of Ruth, not to comfort, but to anchor, because pain this deep makes people forget who they are. Catherine screamed for more laudanum. She begged, she cursed, she clawed at her skin and bit her own tongue. Ezekiel didn't flinch. He knew what pain did to a person, and he knew what waited on the other side of it. By the 4th day, the worst had passed. Catherine was pious, so there was hollow, soaked in sweat, but present, awake, herself. And for the first time she stood without assistance, leaned on the windowsill, stared into the garden she hadn't seen in years, then whispered, "He's going to burn, Ezekiel. I don't care how long it takes. We'll salt the ashes." He said nothing, because he was already drawing the map. Power, real power, doesn't just destroy men. It transforms them, slowly, quietly. It makes monsters feel righteous. and victims feel insane. For nearly 16 years, Catherine had lived in that transformation, her body bloated by drugs, her mind fractured by gaslight, her memories called hallucinations by every man who wanted to keep her silent. But now, the mask was cracking. Each day after the detox, Ezekiel pushed her further. He made her walk, first to the hallway, then to the garden steps. It was grueling. She wheezed, her joints ached, her muscles screamed with each motion. But he didn't let her stop. He measured progress not in distance, but in resistance. If she cursed him, it meant she was alive. Her meals changed too. No more pastries or sugared bread. Ezekiel brought lean meats, wild vegetables, bone broth, and bitter roots to stimulate her gut and mind. She hated it at first, but after a week, the inflammation in her face began to fade. Her hands shook less, her words no longer slurred. She was re-entering her body, returning from the place where they'd imprisoned her. One afternoon, as he helped her walk beneath the oak trees, Catherine stopped. Her breath caught. "I remember something," she said. Ezekiel waited. "There was a night. I was 12. My father said I was dreaming, but I wasn't. I saw them." Her hands clenched. There were 13 men in the cellar. Candles, chanting. The walls were wet with blood, Ezekiel. And something was breathing down there with them. Not a man, not an animal, something else. He didn't speak, not yet. "They made me watch," she continued. "They said I was to be initiated, but I screamed. I ran. And the next morning my father said it never happened, that I'd been sick, that I had fallen. I tried to write it down. I did. But he found the pages. After that, the drugs started, so I wouldn't remember." He turned toward Ezekiel. "But I do remember." He nodded. "I buried new pages in the rose garden," she whispered. "Dates, names, voices I heard through the floor. I don't know how many survived the rain, but some of it's still there." That night, after the house had gone quiet, Ezekiel slipped into the garden. He dug under the third rosebush with a flat rock. 6 inches down, he struck something wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, 47 pages, still legible. Names, dates, symbols, evidence. The first weapon had just been recovered. The oilcloth felt like it was pulsing in his hands. Not from magic, from weight, history. 17 years of secrets stuffed into one package, hidden under the very roses Silas used to boast about to visiting ministers. Ezekiel brought it inside Catherine's room without a word. She was sitting upright, hands folded, a faint sheen of sweat still on her brow, her eyes locked onto the bundle the way a starving animal looks at food. He set it down on the bed, unwrapped it carefully. The pages were brittle but intact. Catherine reached out with trembling fingers and flipped through the first few. Her handwriting at 12 was small, uneven, frantic. Dates, sketches of men's rings and seals, words written phonetically. Latin she'd heard but couldn't spell. And at the top of the first page, in letters almost carved into the paper, "Brethren." She stared for a long time. Then she looked up at Ezekiel. "They called themselves something else too," she whispered. "Harvesters. Takers. They said Georgia's soil was theirs because they'd fed it first. They believe the land remembers, that blood binds it to them." Ezekiel kept turning pages. There were names he already knew: Pelham, Crenshaw, Fanning, and others he didn't. Next to some were symbols: a scythe, a circle with a slash, a child's crude drawing of a man with a goat's head. At the back of the bundle was a folded square of darker paper. Catherine hesitated before handing it to him. "That," she said quietly, "I drew the night it happened." He unfolded it. A charcoal sketch, the cellar, the circle of men, and at the center, something crouched, not quite human. Long arms, a face covered in black cloth. Behind it, the shape of a door, but not a normal door. A stone arch sunk into the cellar floor, leading somewhere that shouldn't exist. They said the door was older than the house, Catherine said. Older than Georg. Built before white men came. They said it only opened for blood. She reached for Ezekiel's hand. He let her take it. If we go down there, she said, we don't come back the same. He closed the sketch and slid it back into the bundle. Then we go prepared, he said. And for the first time since his family died, Ezekiel Cross almost smiled. They needed allies, not friends who murmured comfort, but men who understood that justice sometimes required becoming the instrument of fear. Ezekiel watched Cypress Grove like a hunter studies terrain before the kill. The brethren were public men with private rights. They smiled in daylight and bled the county at night. Their arrogance was their flaw. They believed mercy and law wrapped around them like armor. Ezekiel intended to find the seams. He first tested the household. Judith trembled but would not betray the house that had employed her life. The field hands were harder, broken by seasons of hunger, but still holding memories like embers. Ezekiel listened. He learned which men kept silence out of cowardice and which kept it as survival. One night he walked the cotton rows and found Tobias, a broad man whose sister had been sold south and never returned. He saw in Tobias a man who would not be soothed by words. Ezekiel offered no sermon. He offered an aim. Strike clean, he told him. Hold nothing back but the plan. They met at the smokehouse after dusk, away from prying ears. Ezekiel showed him Catherine's pages and names. Tobias's face shifted from suspicion to a hard focus. He agreed without flourish. A pact formed. Protect one another. Keep your head down. Act when the hour is right. Ezekiel recruited others in the shadows. Henry the blacksmith, who knew how to shape iron that would hold an edge. Malachi the well-tender, who knew the patterns of carts and men. Sarah, a laundry woman who memorized orders and overheard confidences. They did not train like soldiers. They moved like ghosts. Night after night they rehearsed routes, practiced silent knocks, and learned tiny signals that would let them synchronize without song. A cough in the parlor, a specific scrape at the back stair, a scrap of red cloth tied to an unseen nail, simple marks that meant now. Ezekiel taught patience. Revenge is a slow calculus, he said. Rush it, and you become the monster you despise. Wait, observe, and the brethren's arrogance will lay them bare. They buried weapons where only roots could claim them. They sabotaged carriage wheels to delay journeys. They became a secret mechanism inside a household that trusted its mythology. And through it all, Silas boasted of his daughter's recovery, unaware that the hands closing around his world were human. The first confrontation came unexpectedly. Silas, drunk with a mixture of relief and vanity, invited the county's elite for dinner, a display of Catherine's miraculous recovery and his own cunning. The table gleamed with silver, candles flickered against the high ceilings, and laughter echoed in the dining room. Everything looked normal. Everything was a lie. Ezekiel moved silently, a shadow in the corners. Catherine sat upright, calm and poised, a porcelain mask of obedience. The brethren would see her, nod politely, never suspecting she had been watching, planning, remembering every slight, every whispered insult, every betrayal. Ezekiel noted positions, who spoke first, who looked away, who drank too much to mask anxiety. Every gesture, every pause, every raised eyebrow was filed away. Then Silas stood. He cleared his throat, lifted a glass, and began the speech he had rehearsed in the mirror for days. Friends, my daughter has been unwell. Doctors failed, treatments failed, until a remarkable man arrived to aid her. He gestured to Ezekiel, who remained stoic, not a flicker of emotion. Silas smiled with the pride of a man who thought he had conquered nature. And now, Silas continued, I have made a most difficult decision. My daughter's care requires someone who succeeds where others have failed. Ezekiel Cross will assume complete authority over her daily life, treatment, and well-being. Gasps, murmurs, shock painted across faces that had never witnessed a white woman entrusted to a slave. Mrs. Pelam's lips trembled, Marcus Fanning blinked rapidly, trying to process what was being said. Reverend Crenshaw's hand clenched around his napkin. Catherine still did not flinch, not a twitch. Her hands rested in her lap, but underneath, fingers gripped tightly. She had been taught to obey. Now she obeyed Ezekiel, silently, unbreakably. Silas's words fell into the room like a guillotine, slicing pride, tradition, and authority. But no one realized authority was already shifting, the balance of power had tipped, and the true reckoning would not come in whispers or rumors. It would come in action. The room still hummed with shock. The brethren had smiled politely, masks of civility covering horror and confusion. They had seen Silas make decisions no society should ever condone. But this was beyond their scripts. Catherine's eyes met Ezekiel's under the flickering candlelight. A silent pact passed between them. No words, just understanding. He would guide her, shield her, sharpen her. She would remember, act, and exact the justice long denied. Ezekiel moved quietly among the servants, signaling Tobias and Malachi, every gesture precise. The brethren's arrogance was their chain. They were confident in their superiority, unaware that those they considered property now commanded the strategy of vengeance. Catherine spoke for the first time, her voice calm, controlled, chilling in its clarity. "Watch and remember, Ezekiel. Every word, every step. These men believe themselves untouchable. They are not." The guests continued to murmur about propriety, medical miracles, and Silas's ingenuity, oblivious to the silent storm gathering in the corners of the room. Each glance, each small movement by Ezekiel and Catherine was catalogued, mental notes for the coming reckoning. Ezekiel's mind raced. He had seen this kind of arrogance before. Men who believed power was eternal because it had been inherited or stolen. They were blind to patience, blind to calculation, blind to consequences. That blindness would become their undoing. Outside, the moon rose over Cypress Grove. The river reflected silver and darkness, a mirror to the chaos brewing in the house. Every leaf, every branch seemed to whisper secrets of the land and of those who had wronged Ezekiel. He considered the house itself, every hallway, every locked door, every servant's room. It was all a labyrinth, a stage, a weapon, and tonight they had begun rehearsing its use. Catherine's body, once weak and dependent on poisons, now radiated the first signs of strength. Her mind, once clouded by laudanum and fear, now absorbed details like a trap being set. She was becoming a weapon, precise, lethal, and patient. And in that room, under candlelight and hidden from the world, Ezekiel understood. The first move had been made. The brethren had no idea the game had already started. The next morning, Cypress Grove felt different. Not outwardly. The fields were still flooded with labor, the sun still scorched the earth, and the usual clamor of the enslaved and the household carried on. But inside, the air had shifted, a quiet tension had taken root, subtle yet unmistakable. Ezekiel began the first phase of the plan. Observation. Every visitor to the house would be catalogued, every word, every gesture, every mannerism. The brethren were meticulous, so meticulous that their arrogance blinded them. They had no concept that someone could catalogue them with equal precision while remaining invisible. Catherine followed him everywhere. Her steps were careful, measured. Her eyes, once dull with sedation, now flickered with intelligence and calculation. Each detail she absorbed was stored, later to be recalled with a precision that would terrify even the strongest men. They mapped the house. Ezekiel memorized corridors, hidden alcoves, the layout of staircases, the weak points in doors. Every servant who could be trusted was included in small, whispered briefings. Tobias, Malachi, Sarah, each had a role, each was indispensable. And then came the first test. A carriage arrived at the front gate, a seemingly ordinary delivery from a local supplier. But Ezekiel watched the driver, the packages, the route. He noticed subtle gestures, a nod from the driver to someone inside the house, the way the gate latch was slightly worn on the left side. Small details, easily overlooked, but critical. Catherine observed quietly beside him, her hands folded. She began noting the inconsistencies in her father's speech, the slip-ups in his recounting of events, the patterns of deception that had governed her life. Ezekiel smiled inwardly. The poison of obedience had been purged, the toxin of awareness had taken root. By evening they convened in the small cabin at the the edge of the grounds. Pages of notes, sketches, and observations were spread across the table. Every plan, every contingency, every calculated move was documented. This was not chaos. This was strategy. And as night fell, the first threads of what would become a meticulously orchestrated reckoning began to weave themselves together. The brethren had no idea, not yet, that they were already ensnared in a web they could not see. By the second week, Catherine had begun to walk the gardens alone. Each step was deliberate, each breath measured. Her body, once bloated and dependent, now carried a new kind of strength, tempered by pain, sharpened by determination. The sun kissed her skin, and for the first time in years, she felt the heat not as an enemy, but as a reminder that she was alive. Ezekiel watched from the shadow of the oak trees, analyzing every movement. She was learning to trust her body again, to command it, to use it as a vessel of control. This was no longer rehabilitation, it was preparation. Together, they began practicing subtle tactics. How to move silently through rooms without alerting the servants or guests. How to hide a presence without seeming absent. How to observe without being observed. Every gesture was a lesson in dominance and perception. Catherine asked questions about the brethren, their rituals, their patterns, their weaknesses. Ezekiel answered carefully, revealing only what she needed to know, the information calibrated to sharpen her judgment, her instincts, her cunning. One evening, as a cool wind swept through the veranda, Catherine paused. Her eyes were dark, burning with a fire Ezekiel hadn't yet witnessed. "They will die," she whispered. "Every last one. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but they will know fear. They will feel it before it is over, and they will remember that I existed." Ezekiel did not answer immediately. He let her words hang. They were not a promise. They were a statement of fact. The girl who had been broken, drugged, and hidden away was now an instrument of inevitability. That night, they met with Tobias, Malachi, and Sarah in the shadows near the smokehouse. Plans were drawn with precision, contingencies mapped, roles assigned, every weak point, every vulnerability noted. And in the dark corners of the plantation, whispers began, soft, fleeting. The servant spoke of movements in the night, shadows where none should be, eyes where none should see. Fear, the first ripple, had entered the house. Ezekiel's hand rested lightly on Catherine's shoulder. "Patience," he said. "Let them live comfortably while we prepare. The longer the brethren believe they are safe, the sweeter the reckoning." Days turned into weeks, and the tension in Cypress Grove thickened like fog over the river. Every servant, every laborer, every shadowed corner became a node in a growing network of silent observation. Ezekiel and Catherine moved as one, anticipating the brethren's patterns, noting every indulgence, every complacent gesture. Silas remained oblivious. To him, the house was returning to order. To the county elite, it was a miracle. His daughter, restored. They laughed politely at her calm demeanor, unaware of the storm gathering beneath the surface. Catherine's transformation became undeniable. Her body, once dependent on laudanum and indulgent pastries, had hardened. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, could assess a man's intent in a single glance. Every nervous tick, every hesitant movement by the brethren or their allies was catalogued. Nothing escaped her. Ezekiel introduced more subtle forms of training. How to feign weakness, how to invite underestimation. Catherine practiced each gesture in the mirrors of the hallway, refining posture, timing, and expression. Every laugh, every sigh, every word was calibrated to disarm or provoke precisely as intended. One night they tested communication with the servants using imperceptible signals. A cough in the kitchen, a flick of a finger, a specific placement of utensils. Tobias and Malachi responded flawlessly, their understanding unspoken but absolute. They were no longer servants. They were instruments of strategy, moving silently, waiting for the first command. Then Catherine began her own reconnaissance. Pretending to sip tea with Silas, she listened to whispered phone-like messages passed between Pelham and Crenshaw during dinner, observed their gestures, the subtle tremors of greed and fear that Ezekiel had taught her to notice. She wrote notes in her hidden journal, revisiting names, dates, and symbols with the PR, precision of a general planning a siege. By the fourth week, Cypress Grove had become a living map of surveillance and control. Every movement of the brethren, every pathway, every escape route was mapped, catalogued, and memorized. They did not yet strike, but the quiet before the storm had never been so heavy. And in the deepest hours of the night, Ezekiel watched Catherine by the window, staring at the moonlit river. Her voice was barely a whisper. "They will all die," she said, "and when they do, every man, every house, every secret will burn." The plan was no longer theoretical. The reckoning had begun. The night they chose was ordinary in every outward way. A moon high and indifferent, the crickets arguing over territory, the river moving like a patient secret. That ordinariness was deliberate. Ezekiel taught them the greatest deception was normalcy. Let the world think nothing unusual stirs, and it will not look for the trap. It began with small ruptures, nearly invisible. A servant asked for a carriage late, a guest delayed in the parlor, a favored hunting dog returned with a limp. Each small break was a test of reaction. The brethren were unconcerned. Arrogance blinded them to the pattern because they could not imagine anyone would dare orchestrate interference under their noses. Catherine spent the evening like a phantom among her father's guests. She laughed at the right moments, touched shoulders as if to comfort, asked about crops and politics like a dutiful daughter. Underneath that mask, her mind moved through the house like a conductor, timing the movements of those who were unseen. She felt in her bones the rhythm Ezekiel had taught: patience, breath, timing. At midnight, the signal they had practiced for weeks slid through the house, a single soft knock at the back stair. It was meaningless to anyone who did not know. For them, it was a synapse firing. Doors opened, curtains shifted, and silhouettes slid into positions that minutes before had been ordinary furniture. The servants moved like a single organism, silent and efficient, the product of long, quiet preparation. They did not seek blood for blood's sake. They wanted to fracture the certainty the brethren wore like armor. They wanted to create a memory of fear, not merely to kill, but to make those who had deemed themselves eternal feel their mortality like a stone in the chest. That was the point Ezekiel hammered into them. Make them remember. Inside his pocket, Ezekiel kept Catherine's pag, as folded like a talisman. He had read them until the ink blurred, until the names were ghosts that whispered direction. Now, the ghosts would be living men who would remember the sound of their own downfall. The night moved long and deliberate. Movement, not massacre. Precision, not chaos. Yet every motion carried weight. Every closed door was a verdict. The house that had held secrets for generations began to echo with the awake sound of consequences finally arriving. Now they waited. The dawn that broke over Cypress Grove carried no birdsong, no soft glow of innocence, only a heavy, suffocating tension. The air smelled of damp earth, smoke from the river mist, and the faint, lingering scent of sweat from unseen labor. Every window reflected not sunlight, but the shadows of men who had begun to feel the first tremors of fear. Catherine moved through the hallways with a new authority, not as a daughter, not as a recovering patient, but as a strategist, a vessel of intent. Her every gesture measured, every glance loaded with the weight of observation. Guests who had spent years believing in their immunity now stumbled through their own ignorance, sensing only a shift they could not name. Ezekiel followed her silently, cataloguing, noting, ensuring every contingency remained secure. The servants moved with unnatural efficiency, invisible to all who were not part of the plan. Every action, from the arrangement of silverware to the placement of chairs, had been rehearsed as part of an unspoken choreography that would, in hours, strike at the brethren's confidence. Silas remained unaware, still boasting of his daughter's recovery to anyone who would listen. To him, Cypress Grove was a palace restored. To Catherine and Ezekiel, it was a battlefield, each room a potential trap, every hallway a line of attack. At midday, Catherine requested to see the cellar. Silas scoffed. He believed it beneath her, an echo of her supposed frailty. Ezekiel allowed her the visit, but not alone. The servant Tobias accompanied her, eyes sharp, hands ready. As they descended the steps into the dark, damp space below, Catherine felt the chill of history brush against her skin. The walls bore stains older than she remembered, symbols carved into the stone, faint traces of rituals long thought erased. "This is where it began," she whispered, voice steady, "and where it will end." Ezekiel remained in the shadows, watching, calculating. The brethren's arrogance had given them access to all their own weaknesses, and every misstep they had made over decades had been documented in Catherine's hand, catalogued, memorized. The moment of reckoning was coming. Above them, the house moved with false normalcy, but below, the pulse of vengeance had begun to thrum. Every step Catherine took in that cellar was a countdown, a drumbeat heralding the collapse of lives built on cruelty, secrecy, and the illusion of untouchable power. The cellar smelled of damp stone, iron, and long-forgotten rituals. Catherine's footsteps echoed faintly against the floor, each step measured, deliberate, a metronome counting down the inevitable. She ran her fingers along the carved symbols, tracing the shapes that had once terrified her as a child. Now, they were guides, markers for the strategy she and Ezekiel had built over weeks. Tobias stood behind her, silent but alert, every muscle ready. The air was thick with anticipation, and Catherine could feel it pressing against her chest. This was not fear of her own mortality. She had faced it too often. This was the power of presence, the weight of being the one who now controlled history. Ezekiel's voice whispered in her mind as she descended. Observe. Learn. Wait. Every ritual object, every mark on the walls, every subtle imperfection in the stonework was a thread they could pull. The brethren had thought these halls secret. They had been wrong. Catherine knelt and ran her fingers over a circle etched into the floor. Mercury stains had long since faded, but the memory remained in the grooves. Her lips moved in silence as she recalled each man, each ceremony, each abuse of power she had been forced to witness. This was not madness. This was justice being mapped. She stood, her shadow stretching against the cold walls, and Tobias followed her lead. Together, they inspected weak points. The loose stone in the far corner, the narrow ventilation shaft that could serve as an escape or entry, the rusted latch that only a careful hand could manipulate. Every flaw would become a weapon. Outside, the plantation continued its ordinary rhythm. Silas boasted, servants moved, the river reflected the indifferent sky. No one suspected that beneath their feet, the foundations of their complacency were being catalogued, studied, and prepared for collapse. Catherine turned to Tobias, voice low but unwavering. "We are not here to be afraid. We are here to understand. Every mark, every secret, every weakness belongs to us now." Ezekiel watched from the shadows above the stairwell, a silent sentinel. The plan was no longer theoretical. The first threads of action were weaving themselves together, and for the first time, Catherine felt not like a victim, not like a pawn, but like the force that would rewrite the rules of this house forever. The following days were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Cypress Grove appeared unchanged to the casual eye, yet beneath the veneer, every conversation, every glance, every gesture was now part of a complex, invisible network. Catherine and Ezekiel moved like shadows within the walls, orchestrating a subtle dissonance that would eventually unravel the brethren's arrogance. Catherine began speaking to Silas with a precision that unsettled him. She asked questions that seemed innocuous but were loaded, planting seeds of doubt. "Father," she would say softly, "did you notice how Pelham lingered near the ledger yesterday? Curious, isn't it?" Silas would dismiss it, but the ripple had already begun. Trust, once absolute, began to fracture. Meanwhile, Ezekiel trained the inner circle, Tobias, Malachi, and Sarah, in silent communication, timing, and small interventions designed to shift power without detection. They moved through the house and grounds, making subtle alterations, adjusting the placement of utensils, opening and closing doors at calculated intervals, leaving small marks that seemed random to anyone else. Each action was a reminder that Cypress Grove was no longer entirely theirs. Catherine spent hours with her journal, revisiting memories and cataloguing new observations. Every conversation, every misstep by the brethren, every unguarded glance was recorded. These were not notes. They were a map of control, a ledger of eventual consequences. Ezekiel called it the architecture of fear. She practiced her voice, her posture, her expressions. A tilt of the head, a faint smirk, a pause at the right moment. All carefully calibrated to unsettle those who had once believed themselves untouchable. The house became a theater, and Catherine its director. One evening, Catherine confronted Silas subtly. "Father, do you remember when you laughed at Tobias in the fields, thinking him powerless? Such confidence. It's dangerous, isn't it?" Silas bristled, but she only smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. The seed of doubt had been planted. Ezekiel observed from the doorway. He did not interfere. He understood that Catherine's power now came from within her, from the combination of memory, intelligence, and patient malice. The brethren, blind in their arrogance, continued to operate under the illusion of control. They had no idea that the storm had already formed, quiet and deliberate, waiting for the precise moment to strike. Spring deepened over Cypress Grove, but the warmth of the season did nothing to soften the tension that now ruled the house. Every corridor, every doorway, every shuttered window had become part of a grand map of observation. The brethren moved through the estate like predators blind to the trap they were walking into. Catherine's mind sharpened daily. She catalogued habits, repetitions, and the subtle hierarchies among Silas's elite guests. A cough, a hesitation, a misplaced fork. Nothing escaped her notice. Each observation was folded into her mental ledger, forming the architecture of domination Ezekiel had described. Ezekiel, meanwhile, orchestrated training in patience and timing. He walked Catherine through scenarios, a sudden intrusion, an unexpected guest, a misstep by Silas. Each rehearsal reinforced the principle that the brethren's arrogance was brittle. They had never faced opposition that was invisible, silent, and patient. Every night, the servants were briefed in whispers. Tobias, Malachi, and Sarah were no longer simply caretakers. They were operatives. Each had their own mental map of the house, their own understanding of how to manipulate perception. They became instruments of psychological pressure, subtle but undeniable. Catherine herself began small experiments in control. She interrupted her father's conversations at precise moments, inserted questions that seemed innocent but triggered hesitation. Silas would stumble over his words, caught between irritation and embarrassment. The brethren, observing, attributed these moments to coincidence or charm, never realizing the deliberate hand behind them. One evening, she summoned Ezekiel to the veranda. Moonlight reflected in the river, silvering the edges of the moss-draped oaks. "They will never suspect," she said quietly. "They will believe nothing has changed, even as we tighten the noose round them. They think they are untouchable, eternal." Ezekiel's voice was calm, precise. "Let them think it. Fear works best when it's unseen. Let them live in comfort while we prepare. Their downfall will taste sweeter for it." Catherine nodded, eyes dark and unwavering. She understood now that power was not brute force. It was patience, observation, manipulation, and the precise application of consequences. And every man who had ever underestimated her would soon learn this truth. Too late. By late spring, Cypress Grove had become a house of shadows and silence, where every sound, movement, and glance was loaded with meaning. To outsiders it appeared serene, orderly, even mundane. But Catherine and Ezekiel knew better. The plantation was a living chessboard, and every pawn, knight, and bishop had its place in a game the brethren would never comprehend until it was too late. Catherine's transformation was now undeniable. Her body, once bloated and debilitated, moved with a controlled grace, every step purposeful, every gesture deliberate. The tremors that had plagued her vanished, replaced by a calm, calculated presence. Her mind, once clouded by laudanum, now operated like a finely tuned engine, anticipating outcomes, predicting reactions, and exploiting weaknesses with ruthless precision. Ezekiel observed her quietly. This was more than recovery, it was evolution. The girl who had been mocked as helpless had become something else, a force, a vector of inevitability. And he had guided her subtly, without overstepping, knowing that the final power had to reside entirely in her hands. That week, Catherine began direct manipulation of the brethren's inner circle. At dinner, she asked seemingly benign questions about crops, the weather, debts, and observed the reactions, noting micro-expressions of tension, fear, or irritation. Each subtle crack in their armor was stored, memorized, and later folded into strategy. Silas, still blind to the transformation, praised her newfound composure, boasting to anyone who would listen, "My daughter is restored. See how far she has come." The brethren nodded, unaware that the very thing they admired was the mechanism of their own undoing. At night, Catherine reviewed her journal, each page a map of surveillance, observation, and calculated intervention. Every detail she had gathered over months was now a blueprint. Into a prelude to consequences, she read over the names of those who had wronged her, Ezekiel, and the innocents they had destroyed. Each word, each note became a mental trigger for the day when control would shift irrevocably. Ezekiel spoke softly from the doorway. "The foundation is set. Patience, Catherine. Let them believe in their safety. The moment we strike, it will be precise, and they will understand the full weight of what they have ignored for so long." Catherine closed her journal, the candlelight flickering across her face. She allowed herself a faint smile, sharp and controlled. The reckoning was no longer abstract. It was imminent. Everything you've watched so far has been preparation. The sharpening, the mapping, the quiet tightening of a net around men who thought themselves immortal. Now the air tastes different. Not yet victory, but the scent of inevitability. The brethren still dine beneath chandeliers, still joke about land and lineage, still assume the world owes them silence. Their arrogance has only made them more visible. Catherine moved through her day with the cold, composed grace of someone who has rehearsed cruelty in a mirror and found it wanting. She watched a man unbutton a coat too slowly, watched a judge tuck his napkin like a talisman, watched a pastor's fingers trace a cross he no longer believed in. Each tick of human ritual was a detail filed away, a future lever to pull. This is the place where a man learns what power really costs. You think power is force. It's not. It's perception. It's the ability to make the world believe in narratives that serve you. Ezekiel taught her that. He taught her to bend the perception of others until their certainty snapped like dry reed. Before we move deeper, I need something from you. And this matters more than a like or a share. If you're watching this to change, to shed the comfortable blindness they trained you in, type the phrase below into the comments twice exactly as written. Do it now and do it again. Salt the ashes. Salt the ashes. Why twice? Because repetition is ritual. Ritual creates identity. Commenting it once is noise. Commenting it twice is a decision. It signals you're no longer a passive observer, but someone electing to remember, to act, to see. It trains the algorithm, and more importantly, trains your mind to lock a phrase to an intention, to purge complacency, to leave nothing smoldering and unchecked. Do it. Type it. If you won't, that's fine. But understand this. This story isn't entertainment. It's a train. And the men who listen to training change the rules of the world around them. If you're ready, write it. If you're not, stay where you are and let the fires stay hidden. When you've done that, we move on. The net tightens and the first fractures will begin to show. Shall we? The first cracks appeared subtly, almost imperceptibly. A glass slipped from a hand at dinner, clattering like a gunshot in the silence of the brethren's arrogance. A chair scraped across the floor, and the sound lingered longer than it should have. Each small disruption was a thread pulled, a pulse of unease that Catherine had planted weeks ago, now beginning to spread. She walked among them with calm authority, offering smiles that hinted at secrets no one dared imagine. Her eyes held a weight that unsettled, a knowledge that went unspoken, but screamed in every glance. Silas remained oblivious, proud of his daughter's apparent recovery, unaware that she had become the instrument of a reckoning far beyond his comprehension. Ezekiel watched from the shadows, noting every reaction. He had orchestrated patience, but now the tempo shifted. The brethren's arrogance was beginning to crack, and once the first panic entered a man's mind, the rest of the structure followed like a house of cards. Catherine began to seed doubt more overtly. A comment about the reliability of a servant, a remark about a ledger misplaced, the subtle insinuation that someone in their circle might betray them, each word calculated, precise. She was no longer a passive participant. She was the unseen architect of anxiety. At night, she reviewed the map of the house in her journal, noting weak points in security, vulnerabilities in behavior, and patterns of complacency. Each entry was not just observation, but a plan, a blueprint for psychological dismantling that required patience and precision. The servants moved like shadows, implementing small but critical disruptions. Windows left slightly ajar, doors locked and unlocked, minor inconveniences that would, over time, erode confidence. They were invisible, ghosts in the machinery of the brethren's lives, yet the effects were cumulative, undeniable, insidious. By the week's end, whispers began to circulate among the county elite, subtle, fearful, unexplained. Questions arose about security, about Silas's judgment, about the strange composure of his daughter. Fear, quiet and patient, had begun its work. Ezekiel and Catherine observed these tremors silently, knowing that the brethren were now beginning to feel the first true weight of their arrogance. Every movement, every reaction, every heartbeat was being catalogued for the day when control would shift completely. By now, the brethren's confidence was no longer whole. It had begun to fracture beneath the invisible pressure Catherine and Ezekiel applied with surgical precision. Each misplaced glance, each hesitant word, each shadow that seemed out of place chipped away at their certainty. They laughed less, they hesitated more, they questioned themselves without knowing why. Catherine used the daylight hours to sharpen her presence. At breakfast, she would comment on small discrepancies, a ledger left open, a chair not aligned, and watch the ripple of tension spread. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was cumulative. Each microaggression, each minor disturbance, compounded into an emotional erosion the brethren could not trace or resist. Ezekiel continued to teach the servants invisible signaling. A nod, a cough, the barely noticeable shift of a foot. Every movement was now purposeful, every reaction rehearsed. The house itself became an instrument, and the people within it played exactly the roles Catherine dictated without understanding why. That evening, Catherine asked to walk the grounds alone, ostensibly for her health. Silas permitted it, thinking her improved strength a cause for pride. But Ezekiel had anticipated this. She carried with her subtle tools of influence, hidden symbols, notes, and a mind trained to read even the smallest sign of threat or weakness. The estate, once her prison, had become her domain. She observed patterns in the way the servants moved, in the behavior of the overseers, in the complacency of her father. Each observation, each careful note, fed the psychological web she was weaving. The brethren's arrogance blinded them to the fact that power was being stripped away, one imperceptible act at a time. Catherine's voice became an instrument of control. She asked questions with the cadence of curiosity, yet each inquiry sowed doubt. Each remark revealed vulnerability. The elite, so certain of their dominion, began to feel the invisible hand of calculation pressing against their very instincts. And as the night drew in, a quiet storm of anticipation built in Cypress Grove. The brethren, unaware, laughed, dined, and drifted through halls that were no longer safe. Every corridor, every room, every shadow had been claimed. The reckoning had begun in whispers and tremors, and soon it would erupt fully. The night air was thick with tension, yet silent, almost reverent. Cypress Grove seemed to hold its breath. Catherine moved through the house with a certainty that came not from fear, but from mastery. Every step she took was deliberate, every gesture measured. She had become something the brethren could not see coming, a force that existed in plain sight, yet invisible. Ezekiel observed from the shadows, his eyes tracking each reaction, each twitch, each whispered word of concern among the servants and overseers. He knew that the brethren's downfall would not arrive as a sudden storm, but as a series of precise strikes, psychological, emotional, inescapable. And tonight, the first real strike would be set in motion. Catherine entered the dining room, where Silas and several guests were gathered, the remnants of dinner on the table. She spoke softly, casually, yet her words carried hidden weight. "I noticed the ledger from the bank was slightly out of place today. Curious, isn't it, Marcus?" The brethren stiffened, confusion flashing across faces. They knew no ledger was missing, no accounts disturbed. Yet the insinuation alone planted doubt. Small disruptions multiplied. Windows left slightly ajar, doors that would not lock, whispered comments in empty rooms. Each of these seemingly trivial acts was a nail in the brethren's sense of control. Fear had not yet taken them fully, but hesitation had begun to seep into every thought, every decision. Catherine then sent Tobias to deliver a note, ostensibly innocuous, to Judge Pelham. The note contained precise, deliberate inaccuracies, small enough to seem accidental, yet enough to trigger scrutiny and doubt. The judge's reaction, though subtle, was exactly as Catherine had calculated: a tightening of the jaw, a glance around the room, the first visible crack in confidence. Ezekiel remained the silent guardian. Watching as the house shifted from ordinary order into a labyrinth of suspicion. Every servant knew their role, every movement choreographed, every reaction anticipated. The brethren's power, once absolute, now existed only as a fragile illusion. By midnight, the plantation hummed with invisible tension. Cypress Grove had become a stage for psychological mastery, and the players were unaware that they were already ensnared. The net had closed around them, quiet, patient, and unstoppable. The following morning, the brethren awoke to a subtle shift in Cypress Grove. The estate seemed unchanged, the same sunlight glinting off the river, the same scent of earth and moss. But the air carried a quiet unease they could not name. Each man sensed instinctively that something was different, yet nothing concrete had happened. This was Catherine's power in full effect, the invisible hand pressing without leaving a mark. She walked among them, serene and composed, her gaze sharp. Silas, still proud of his daughter's apparent recovery, had no idea that her calm was a weapon. The guests, accustomed to seeing her as fragile, dismissed her presence as ordinary, never suspecting that each smile, each subtle tilt of the head, carried calculated intent. Catherine's questions grew sharper, more pointed. At breakfast, she asked Marcus Fanning about the precise handling of a shipment of rice, adding a small, deliberate misstatement about quantities. Marcus corrected her, visibly unsettled, and she smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. The ripple spread. Seeds of doubt had been planted. The brethren's certainty had begun to waver. Ezekiel continued his silent orchestration. He had positioned Tobias and the other servants strategically, ensuring that every corridor, every door, every room became a tool of subtle disruption. A servant would whisper a rumor in passing, a door would creak at the perfect moment, a candle would flicker as though signaling some unseen presence, each act invisible to the untrained eye, but cumulative in its effect. Catherine reviewed her journal in the quiet of the veranda that evening, cataloguing each reaction, each hesitation, every twitch of discomfort, every misstep, every misplaced word became part of a growing tapestry, a blueprint of control, a map of domination. She had learned to weaponize observation, patience, and precision that. At night she descended to the cellar, now fully familiar, tracing the etched symbols, feeling their resonance. This was no longer a place of fear. It was a command center, a nerve center of strategy. Ezekiel's plan and her vengeance intertwined, each feeding the other. And in the shadows, the brethren slept unaware that their minds were under siege, that the very foundations of their perceived control were crumbling silently. The first real fractures had begun, quiet, unseen, unstoppable. The brethren's composure was now threadbare. Each interaction carried the invisible weight of Catherine's scrutiny. A pause too long at the dinner table, a glance that lingered, a cough out of rhythm. All were magnified in their minds. They could not understand why the walls of their certainty were trembling, only that they were. Catherine moved with deliberate normalcy, each gesture a calculated vector of influence. She walked the halls as if nothing had changed, yet her presence alone altered the behavior of those around her. Silas praised her newfound poise, oblivious to the fact that his daughter had become a strategist, a silent orchestrator of their unease. Ezekiel instructed Tobias and the inner circle in subtle manipulations, minor rearrangements of furniture, repositioning of objects, whispered comments timed precisely. Nothing was overt, nothing traceable. Yet cumulatively, the brethren's confidence was eroding. This was the mastery of invisible control, the art of making men doubt themselves without ever touching them. Catherine began to speak more openly, her questions laced with hidden implications. "Have you noticed, Judge Pelham," she asked casually at breakfast, "that the ledger seems different today? I could have sworn we reconciled it last night." The judge's eyes flickered with unease, heart racing against logic. He tried to dismiss it, but the seed of uncertainty had already taken root. Even Silas could feel it, the subtle disruptions, the strange timing, the small, inexplicable errors that seemed to follow him everywhere. He tried to assert control, but the more he did, the more obvious it became that the house, the servants, even his daughter were no longer predictable. Nightfall brought a quiet storm. Catherine descended into the cellar again, moving like a shadow among symbols of fear. Each etched mark, each historical remnant of the Brahm, Aethren's rituals, was now a tool. She traced them, memorized them, catalogued their weaknesses. Ezekiel watched from the stairwell, a silent witness to the transformation of a girl once powerless into a woman who commanded the very essence of fear itself. By the end of the night, the first tangible effects appeared, a minor error in the accounting, a misstep in a ritual, a whispered doubt shared between two of the brethren. The cracks were widening and the fall of their perceived omnipotence had begun in earnest. By now, the brethren were no longer confident. Each man moved with hesitation, questioning the solidity of the ground beneath him, though he could not name the cause. Their arrogance, once absolute, had been methodically eroded. Cypress Grove had become a house where shadows whispered and silence carried meaning. Every corridor, every shuttered window, every servant's glance was a calculated element of control, designed to destabilize and intimidate. Catherine's mastery of observation had reached a new level. She noted the rhythm of each man's movements, the subtle shifts in posture, the micro-expressions that revealed doubt. A twitch of the lip, a flicker in the eye, a hesitation before speech. Each became data, each a weapon. Silas, still blind to the orchestration, believed her poise a triumph of health and obedience. He had no idea that he was watching his daughter become the architect of his humiliation. Ezekiel's strategy unfolded like clockwork. Tobias, Malachi, and Sarah moved invisibly through the house, performing small acts that seemed inconsequential but collectively undermined the brethren's sense of control. A misaligned chair, a candle extinguished prematurely, whispered rumors of absent voices. Every detail built tension, subtly unbalancing the social order that had once seemed unshakable. Catherine began to use her voice deliberately, asking innocuous questions with hidden implications. "Marcus, I noticed a discrepancy in the accounting today. A small difference. Could it be an oversight or perhaps intentional?" Marcus stiffened. The other brethren pretended to ignore it, yet each man felt the pressure, the creeping unease that now defined their existence at Cypress Grove. The true genius of their method was patience. The brethren had been trained to expect challenges in bursts, overt, dramatic, temporary. They were unprepared for a slow, relentless erosion of certainty. Catherine and Ezekiel had taught her to harness the power of anticipation, of expectation, manipulated and misdirected, until paranoia and fear became the dominant reality. Night came, thick and oppressive, and Catherine walked the grounds alone. The moonlight traced shadows across the river and moss-draped oaks. She touched the symbols etched in stone, feeling their weight, their resonance. The brethren's arrogance had been stripped bare. Soon they would see it, when it was already too late. Cypress Grove had become a theater of silent terror. The brethren moved through it, unaware that every moment, every glance, every breath was being catalogued and analyzed. They believed themselves untouchable, safe in their arrogance, yet the foundation of that safety had been deliberately undermined. Patience had turned into power, subtlety into dominion, and Catherine had become the unseen force they could neither see nor resist. She spoke with a calm precision that belied the storm within. Every question was a probe, every casual remark a lever. "Silas, did you notice the ledger entries from yesterday?" she would ask. "They seem altered. Curious, isn't it?" The words were simple, almost innocent, but the effect was immediate. Doubt entered minds trained for certainty. Confidence faltered. They began to question themselves before they even realized why. Ezekiel moved like a shadow, his presence unseen yet felt. He had orchestrated every minute detail, the placement of objects, the timing of movements, the subtle cues to his operatives. Tobias, Malachi, and Sarah were extensions of his will, instruments of psychological manipulation. Every whisper, every creak of the floorboard, every flicker of light served a single purpose: to make the brethren aware, subtly, that their control was slipping. Catherine's body had become a weapon. Her recovery was complete, not only physically but mentally. She walked with authority, her eyes sharp, her gestures deliberate. The tremors and illness of the past had been replaced with calculated strength. Every inch of her presence communicated power, yet it was invisible to those who relied on outdated measures of strength and dominance. The brethren were beginning to fear what they could not name. Small errors, minor inconsistencies, subtle suggestions of betrayal, all magnified under the weight of their own arrogance, the psychos. Logical pressure was cumulative, relentless, and invisible, and in that pressure, Catherine found the perfect tool. By midnight, Cypress Grove was alive with quiet anticipation. Shadows whispered, corridors became paths of observation, and the brethren slept with unease they could not fully understand. Every instinct in them screamed danger, yet they could not locate it. The first wave of calculated terror had been set, and the escalation was imminent. The night had grown thick with anticipation, and Cypress Grove breathed like a living thing, alive with the tension Catherine and Ezekiel had meticulously cultivated. Every room, every shadow, every flickering candle became an instrument of control. The brethren, blind to the manipulation, sensed only an undefined unease. the slow tightening of a psychological vice. Catherine moved silently through the house, her senses heightened, observing the smallest details. A misplaced napkin on the dining table, a candle extinguished too soon, a servant's glance that lingered. All were threads in a web of precision. Each brethren member, so certain of their dominion, now walked on uneven ground, guided by instincts that betrayed them at every step. Ezekiel observed from a distance, noting every micro-reaction, every twitch, every hesitation. This was no longer about patience, it was about inevitability. The brethren had been conditioned to assume stability, to rely on their perceived control. Catherine had taken that foundation and methodically dismantled it, leaving only the illusion of safety, while the machinery of their undoing operated invisibly around them. At dinner, Catherine spoke with calm authority. "Marcus, I noticed a ledger discrepancy. Yesterday it balanced differently. Perhaps an oversight, or something more intentional?" The casual question landed like a stone in still water. Each man at the table stiffened imperceptibly, tension crawling into every sinew. They were aware something was amiss, but could not articulate what it was. Silas, proud of his daughter's composure, remained oblivious. To him, she was simply recovered, elegant, polite, a testament to his care and success. Yet he did not see that her presence had become a weapon. Every gesture, every glance, every word was part of a calculated strategy to unmake the very people he considered untouchable. By midnight, the first fractures had become visible. Subtle errors, whispered doubts, misremembered details. The brethren's certainty was eroding faster than they could respond, and Cypress Grove had become a crucible for fear and anticipation. Catherine's hand guided this transformation, silent yet absolute, and the moment of truth approached like the slow, unstoppable roll of a tide. The brethren's world had become unmoored. They awoke each morning with a gnawing sense that something was wrong, yet nothing tangible had changed. Every habit, every assumption, every belief in their invulnerability now carried a tremor of doubt. Cypress Grove had become a labyrinth of uncertainty, and Catherine was the unseen architect, the force that made the invisible tangible. She moved through the estate with an effortless authority, her body and mind fully recovered, her presence commanding. Each word was measured, each gesture deliberate. She asked questions that seemed innocuous, about ledgers, schedules, the placement of objects, but each one forced the brethren to confront inconsistencies they had never noticed, doubts they had never admitted. Ezekiel orchestrated the servants with military precision. Tobias, Malachi, Sarah, every quiet hand in the house became an extension of his strategy. Minor disturbances, carefully timed whispers, a creaking floorboard, a flickering candle. These invisible tools corroded confidence with cumulative effect. The brethren felt it instinctively, a house that seemed familiar yet betrayed them at every corner. Catherine's psychological dominance grew with each day. She understood the rhythms of fear, the subtleties of authority, the ways in which silence could terrify more than action. She allowed moments of kindness, calculated gestures of trust, only to reinforce the illusion of stability before shattering it with precision. Silas remained unaware, proud of his daughter's apparent recovery, yet blind to the fact that she had become a strategist who could unravel the most entrenched power structures without leaving a trace. The brethren's arrogance had been their undoing. They could not see the net tightening around them until it was too late. By the end of the day, subtle chaos had already taken root. Misaligned item, unexplained discrepancies, the weight of suspicion in the air. The brethren, trained to command, now found themselves manipulated, uncertain, questioning even their own instincts. Cypress Grove had transformed into a crucible of inevitability. The brethren's downfall was no longer a plan. It was a living force, patient, invisible, unstoppable. Catherine and Ezekiel had become the masters of perception itself, and soon the first violent tremors of their strategy would erupt into unavoidable reality. The final stage of their unraveling had begun. Cypress Grove pulsed with the quiet intensity of a predator closing in, invisible yet unavoidable. Every creak of floorboard, every flicker of candlelight, every seemingly trivial comment was now a weapon. Catherine moved with a lethal calm, her recovery complete, her mind honed like a blade, every thought sharpened for the moment of reckoning. The brethren were already fraying. Marcus Fanning misread instructions, Judge Pelham hesitated in judgment, Silas's control faltered, all small, seemingly insignificant errors that compounded into a psychological avalanche. Catherine watched, patient, savoring the perfect rhythm of chaos she had orchestrated. Each reaction confirmed the precision of her work, each falter a note in the symphony of retribution. Ezekiel remained the silent architect, unseen but omnipresent. Every servant acted with purpose, every disturbance calculated to perfection. The brethren could feel the weight of unseen eyes, the pressure of invisible hands guiding their every misstep. They did not yet know who commanded this storm, only that it existed and could not be resisted. Catherine's dialogue became sharper, almost surgical. She asked questions that seemed casual but were loaded with implication. "Have you checked the cellar, Judge? Or perhaps someone else has been experimenting?" The brethren stiffened, instinctively defensive, already vulnerable to the seed of doubt she planted. Fear had replaced certainty, hesitation replaced decisiveness. Silas, proud yet naive, still believed he controlled the situation. He did not realize that his daughter had become the embodiment of patience, strategy, and psychological dominance. Every smile, every tilt of the head, every measured glance was part of a system designed to dismantle them piece by piece. By nightfall, Cypress Grove had transformed into a stain. G for the inevitable. Shadows held secrets, corridors whispered tension, and the brethren moved as though under invisible strings. Catherine's mastery over perception, combined with Ezekiel's orchestration, had made certainty itself a dangerous illusion. Soon the visible chaos would arrive, the moment where patience and strategy gave way to consequence, and the brethren would understand finally that they had been outmaneuvered in every sense. The night of reckoning arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly. Cypress Grove held its breath, as if aware that the culmination of decades of cruelty, calculation, and suppressed rage was about to unfold. The brethren, so certain of their invincibility, were now prey in a game they had never even noticed. Their arrogance had blinded them to the forces moving around them. Silent, patient, inevitable. Catherine and Ezekiel had orchestrated everything with meticulous precision. Every doubt planted, every fear amplified, every subtle disruption had been leading to this moment. The house itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, corridors echoing with the silent rhythm of impending justice. Each member of the brethren felt it, though they could not name it, the invisible noose tightening with every heartbeat. The first strike was psychological. Whispered rumors of betrayal, subtle miscommunications, small errors magnified into crises. The brethren argued, doubted, and mistrusted each other in ways that escalated without visible cause. By midnight, their cohesion had crumbled. Panic and suspicion replaced certainty. The power they believed immutable now hung by a thread, fraying with each passing minute. Then came the physical manifestations. Minor fires in storage rooms, sabotaged equipment, structural weaknesses revealed at the exact right moment. Cypress Grove, once a symbol of control and authority, became an arena of disarray. Each act was precise, deliberate, untraceable, yet devastating. The estate itself seemed to exact vengeance, guided by the hands of those who had suffered silently for too long. Catherine emerged as both architect and executioner. She moved through the chaos with calm authority, her presence a testament to the power of patience, strategy, and psychological mastery. Ezekiel remained beside her, silent, ensuring that every action aligned perfect. It lay with their calculated plan. Together, they had turned the instruments of oppression into tools of retribution. By dawn, the brethren were broken, scattered, and powerless. Cypress Grove bore the marks of upheaval, yet the final blows were delivered not with brute force, but with the quiet, deliberate mastery of minds who had learned the dark art of patience and precision. Justice had been extracted with elegance and inevitability. And as the first light of morning touched the river and the moss-draped oaks, Catherine stood tall, fully in command, fully aware that the world she had inherited was now one she could reshape. The secrets of power, vengeance, and control had been revealed, and those who had once held dominion over life and fear had been undone by the very forces they thought they controlled. The story of Cypress Grove would echo through history, a warning to those who underestimate patience, strategy, and the quiet fury of the wronged.